Welcome to The Being Leader. I'm Annabelle Graham. Welcome back to The Being Leader. And today's episode is episode 5 of our third series. And today we're going to be talking about transition and what transition means when we're exploring change. Because really it's about how we deal with that bit in the middle. And that's often the sticky bit. So why don't people talk about transition when we are exploring change? Well, I think it's because we can get a little bit obsessed with change and the process of change. We often view it as a linear entity, a journey from one point to the other, with a series of steps in the middle that will get us there. And because this is how we tend to view everything we do. Just think about it. If we're moving house, it's about selling one place and moving to another, with loads of steps in the middle. If we're changing jobs, it's about leaving one job and taking another role elsewhere. And if we're restructuring a team or a business, we start off with one structure and end up with another. In all of these cases, varied as they are, we tend to focus on the activities that we're going to take to move us from one state to the other, the steps in the process. And it's very linear and has a starting point and an end state. And seemingly, one thing happens after another. But the bit that we forget about is the human condition, the impact of changing from one state to the next. And that's the issue of transition. You see, we humans aren't quite so linear. And that's what makes that bit in the middle so much more complicated than expected. Because we don't necessarily follow the lovely steps that the change plan thinks we should. Change is defined as an external event or situation that takes place. So this could be a new leader joining in the organisation, a restructure, a new process or a piece of software that's being introduced. But transition is defined slightly differently. And I'm going to use a definition by a theorist called William Bridges, who really focused a lot on transition. We're going to explore a model of his today. He sees it as the inner psychological process that people go through as they internalise and come to terms with the new situation that this change brings about. This change can put people in crisis. The starting point for dealing with transition is not the outcome, but the endings that people have in leaving the old situation behind. So Bridges sees transition as having 3 distinct phases. Endings. So that's the first phase of transition, when people start to identify what they're losing and learn how to deal with those losses. Because we always have a loss. You know, it might be a really welcome loss and we might be over the moon that something's changed, but very often it's something that we're quite attached to. And if we've been working in a certain way or using a process for a long time or being used to that state for a long time, we can find it really difficult to let go. So we need to determine what is over and what's being left behind and also what we're going to keep. So this could be relationships, it could be processes, it could be team members, it could be locations. The middle piece is the neutral zone. And that's the second step of transition that comes after letting go, where people go through an in-between time when the old is gone and the new state isn't yet fully formed. So this is when critical psychological mindsets take place. It's the very core of the transition process. And it's the time between the old reality, so that old sense of identity that we had, and the new one. And this is when people can get stuck, because we should be creating new processes and learning what new roles are. But often we can really feel like we're in flux and that there's a lot of confusion and a lot of distress because we are neither in the new state or the old state. And then the final stage of transition is about new beginnings. Now, beginnings involve new understandings, new values, and new attitudes. And beginnings are marked by an expression of a fresh identity, a new way of being. And when we have a well-managed transition process, it allows people to establish new roles and really understand what they're there to do and what their purpose is and the part that they play and how they can contribute to that and participate more effectively. If that isn't put in place, then people can continue in that neutral zone for much longer. Now, just discussing that, many of us may recognise these phases from change processes that we've been part of in organisations or change processes that we've gone through in our personal life. Because I can guarantee all of us have experienced it at some point. And if you can't think of when you have, I'm just going to ask you to recall a really recent example which applied to all of us. And that's the first pandemic lockdown of 2020. This, along with subsequent lockdowns, created a real roller coaster of emotions, which mirrored that emotional response to change that we see in transition. And that emotional response to change is something that many of you may have heard of. It's the change curve or the grief curve. And the grief curve was popularised by a psychotherapist in the late 1960s called Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And it follows the following pattern. Her original model had 5 stages. There are others depending on which model that you look at. So this is how it goes. So initially there's shock. And then often there's a denial that the change is happening. And then sometimes we get into anger. And that anger can come out either in the denial or in blame. And very often about blaming others, which is the first stage of that blame. Later, we might move to recognising that we have a part to play in that. And we might then start to blame ourselves. We then have some tipping points when we get into bargaining and then depression. And depression's often that moving point before we go into acceptance and start on that journey towards new beginnings, where we have exploration, decision, and integration. So let's just think about 2020 and see how did this play out. So, shock. If you think about when this happened, we were seeing mounting daily figures of illness cases for COVID and deaths for COVID. And then the sudden confinement that everybody went through as governments decided to lock down their countries and people were made to stay in and were only allowed to go outside once a day and for very, very limited periods. People's roles stopped. Many people were sent to work from home if they could, and if not, they were put onto furlough. So this was a dramatic change, and you could just feel the shock and the fact that people were stunned, ricocheting around the globe. Then we had denial. This kicked in for some people. And you saw that coming out through conspiracy theories where people were saying that it was made up, that it was fake news. And some people thought they could carry on as normal while the world came to a halt around them and, would go out more and just go, the rules don't apply to me. And at the same time, there was also a lot of anger and blame. And this was directed at a number of sources. To China, who were seen as the apparent source, to the government, to those people who failed to follow guidelines, anyone where we could move the blame, this happened. Some people, however, did turn that blame towards personal responsibility and recognised that, we had a part to play. And that's when they started calling out those who maybe were flouting the rules in certain places. We also saw a degree of bargaining. And this was when people were starting to move into that transition phase and really trying to work out what they could get away with. Did one trip out of day really mean one trip? Was it different if you had dogs and you had to walk them twice a day? And what was defined by a local journey? We'll all remember in the UK, Dominic Cummings and the Barnard Castle affair. And then very quickly, within a couple of weeks, we saw that for some people, they hit that depression stage. There was a slump, a lull in the pushback, where people realised that, this lockdown wasn't going to be for the 2 or 3 weeks that the governments had said it was going to be initially. This was here for the foreseeable future, and we were going to have to get on with it. At this point, people hit acceptance. This was the letting go point, where people stopped resisting and started to recognise that things had changed. This was our new reality. And in some ways, it gave people a green light in moving forward. For people to accept that, the old is no longer, and they're going to have to do something new. So this manifested in a number of ways. We had people bonding. So whether that was over clap for carers or neighbourhood musicians or people helping out locally or coming off furlough and, taking up different roles in the community to be able to help and support those that they could. There were also those who settled into working from home or found new ways to connect with friends and family now that they realised that this wasn't going away and they weren't necessarily going to be able to see people the same face to face. And this brought out the experimentation phase. That came out in so many ways. People started new fitness routines, new hobbies, new ways of connecting with people, new working patterns. In some cases, they pivoted their business and started in new markets because they had no choice or opportunity, and this opened up things they'd never have considered before. And as we carried on, as lockdown went on, then decisions and integrations took place. People decided what they wanted to keep from this new world and what they wanted to let go of completely and not go back to, and started to integrate new ways of being into their routines. And when the first lockdown lifted, decisions were made again, as some people decided that the new ways they had discovered were better than the old ones. And we can see that through the ongoing proliferation of hybrid working, people recognising that spending more time working from home gives them a better work-life balance, and that often some of those new business ventures that started continued and became the new business. And people's new fitness routines and that sense of balance continued too. So if we reflect back, we can remember what this meant specifically for us and how it built over time through the subsequent lockdowns. And also how people roller coasted through those emotional curves, riding the wave, and either carrying on or getting stuck as they progressed. Now, one thing to note, however, is if we think back, how fast people went through this emotional curve drastically differed. Some people moved to acceptance straight away, and that endings piece was quite simple for them. Some people never got there and stayed firmly stuck in blame and denial, closeted away and hoping that the old way of being would come back soon. And this often happens when we see change in organisations. And this different speeds happens too, because we can predict that people will move through transition, but we can't necessarily predict how long it's going to take. That's very personal. So if the transition is something that's happening within your organisation or within a team, we can find that people are in very, very different stages. So how do we need to deal with this? How do we need to work through these transition stages and make sure that we can deal with them more effectively? So let's look at those 3 stages of Bridges' model now and think about some simple steps that we can take at each of those stages to either move ourselves through it or support other people through it. So the first stage of his model, remember, was endings. It's accepting the change that has occurred and accepting the ending. And at this stage, we need to work out how we can let go. Accept that what we knew has ended, grieve, and move forward. So it's about admitting to ourselves and others that the change has occurred. So that could be leading by example. And it really requires honesty and authenticity with our people to recognise that, it's gone, it's over. And it may mean also that we need to seek a little bit more information and learn about the nature of the change without judging it to begin with. And most importantly is to take note of what's been lost and what's been gained. And take the view that different isn't right or wrong, it's just different. And I've often found that having this discussion with those people who are affected can be very useful, because the view of what has been lost can be very different from individual to individual. So just opening up that conversation, having it as a team or as a group, can be really helpful to understand all of the different aspects that are affecting people, which we may not have considered, and what we can do to support it through the later stages. The second part of transition is about the neutral zone. We really need to dwell in this stage because this is the most uncomfortable stage. It's often a time of confusion and having to live without a really clear ending, but also having no clear beginning. So it's a time to gain clarity, to allow that to develop and to start to point us in a new direction. So the first thing that we can do to help dwell in that neutral zone is to realise that uncertainty is an integral part of this, between an ending and a new beginning. So we can't expect everything around us to be perfectly formed at this stage. We often don't know enough facts, or we haven't tried out the new ways of working to work out what's actually going to stick. What can then help with that as we move through it is to set short-term goals. So when we're going through change, people often look too far out. We think about 6 months' time or 12 months' time about what's going to be different. But actually, if we shorten our time frame for the goals to a period where we can predict what might happen, then that becomes much more concrete for people and they can hold on to it and attach to it in a much better way. So that might mean our goal is 3 months, if that's how far ahead we can see. Or it might just be a month. Or if we're going through a really complex change process, this might be week to week, fortnight to fortnight, and that's okay. And it's also important to remember that when we feel uncertain and confused, that we need to think about what's important to us and connect back to our values, because they very often can help us gain a sense of direction and purpose. And then the final part is about starting that new beginning. Often when we sit dwelling in that neutral zone, we begin to find clarity. And that means we can start to accept the challenge of working in a changed environment. Thinking of this phase as a fresh start and really thinking about things that we can start to actively do to embrace this new environment. So that's the first bit. Embrace the new. It could be a new location, new people, new ways of working. Try it out, experiment, and share your experiences with others so you can start to create new patterns and habits together. Start experimenting, because that will allow you to create strategies for tackling new problems. When you meet a new challenge, re-emphasize the reason for the change and recognize the reason of why we're beginning anew, and try things out. The first thing we would try may not be the thing we end up with. So just treating everything as an experiment for how we can move it forward allows us to see what works and what doesn't work. And the final part about that is acknowledging when it does work, when we have those small wins. So if we can review what we've achieved regularly, this will really enable us to see how far we've come. Now remember, the phases that people go through will vary. Not because they aren't necessarily experiencing them, but you're not with them all the time. So you may not see those changes really evidently. And of course, the speed of progressing the changes will differ from person to person. So recognize that in a team, you could all be in different parts of this transition. And as a leader, you're also going to be going through this. So you'll have your own personal uncertainty and resistance to the changes. So recognizing your process of going through endings, neutral zones and new beginnings will also affect your work and the people around you too. I found that actually it can be really useful having this as an open discussion in the team and working out where everybody is, because once we know that, it doesn't change the situation, but it does give us a much better understanding of why we may be seeing the behaviours and the emotions that are coming out. Because when we do that, we can acknowledge where we all are and discuss ways of supporting each other through the process. So I want to end with a quote. And it's quite an old one. So Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher, who was based in Ephesus in approximately 500 BC, is credited with the theory that change is the only constant. What he actually said is, no man ever steps in the same river twice, because it's not the same river and he's no longer the same man. Remember, every time we experience change and transition, we learn. And in that learning, we build our capacity. And by building our capacity, we build our resilience to be able to move forward and cope with change more easily the next time. So I hope some of these areas have been useful for you to explore some change that you may be experiencing currently. And just reflect on the stages that you're in, where your team is, and which parts of those actions are going to be useful for you to be able to move forward. And when we come back the next time, we're going to be thinking about change and how it impacts teams, and really dig into those things that we see a little bit more. Thanks for listening to The Being Leader.